Well, great question. Good afternoon, firstly. What a way to start. I do what I do because I guess a couple of reasons, really. Number one is I want to give back. I want to give back to people, so I want to help people. I want to help people improve. And I think specifically, I want to help people that do the things that I can't. So I'm a failed rugby player. I had everything needed like physically, but I had hands like cow's tits, so I was never going to make it. And I wanted to work with people, I guess, who were talented enough, and then hope that I could shape them physically and mentally to get to the level that they could be and deserve to be. So I think that's where my motivations lie for why I do what I do, and it's a lot of fun. I mean, you just if you're working in a team sport or whatever you're working in with a group of lads or a group of, it's just a bit of a laugh when you go to work. You have fun, you interact, you socialize, you're around people, and for me that's great.
Yeah, and there's a bit of a shameless plug, something you sent me a while back in regards to coaches' reflections and sharing funny stories. I'd highly recommend that PDF if people are interested in the laughter that does come with team sports.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure everybody's got a few deep and dark stories in their closet. So maybe one day we'll get them all down on paper, and somebody will write a book about it. Hey.
And in terms of your philosophy then, how does that feed into your experience with dealing with tactical athletes then, or where does that fit in, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's another quite a good question, because I was thinking about this. Can I really define and articulate my training philosophy, and outside the realms of get people to do what they need to do to the level they need to be able to do it whenever they need to be able to do it? I don't really feel like I've got an easily definable philosophy. My philosophy is get out the way as much as I possibly can, and allow the coaches to do their job, or allow the cadre to do their job if we're talking tactical, or allow the operators to go and do their job. And I need to, as a coach, have the least amount of impact on their jobs from a detrimental perspective, and the maximum amount of impact on their job performance from a positive perspective. So there's that side of things with regard, like specifics of how I would coach things, as in the finer details and the principles of strength and conditioning. No, I don't have anything definitive, because it changes for every single individual based on the requirements of the job or the task. So there's no definitives I can give you there. There's a fundamental requirement to be adaptable at all times, just about in every environment, but specifically in the environments I've been in for the last 3 to 5 years. And then the major changes for me really have in the last, I guess 5 years, really have come from the approach towards people, and treating everybody as an individual, regardless of what we think about tactical operators. They're people, normal people with an extraordinary job. So they're just the same as you and I in lots of ways. They still have thoughts, feelings, emotions, and that impacts their behavior, their physiology. And they still need tactics and strategies and skills to control those. Still get influenced by things like a disagreement with their missus, the kids being ill. They'll get impacted by that. And they're just humans. So really trying to understand how to apply the principles of strength and conditioning, good coaching, to good communication as well, regardless of who those people are. So I suppose that would be my philosophy. It's a little bit fluffy, a little bit woolly, but you have to change what you do depending on who's in front of you, and that's a fundamental for me.
And speaking about who's in front of you, in our off-air discussions in the past, you was discussing about how you've gone from, for example, being based with the EIS to then ending up in Romania and -16 conditions. Do you want to give the listeners, I suppose, Reader's Digest of your journey so far, and how life has taken you to these different countries and working with the tactical athletes that you have done?
Yeah, well, geez, it's a it's a long-winded story. It's a bit weird and wonderful with a few twists and a few twists in there. So I began my journey as a fitness instructor. I decided that I got into personal training or an obsession with becoming a personal trainer when I saw Britney Spears' personal trainer on TV when I was, I don't know, maybe in my single figures still, when I was 8, 9, 10, and I saw him on TV and I was like, wow, look at this guy, look who's training, that's amazing, I want to be him. So that was all I ever wanted to do, and I went through the whole of school knowing that was all I wanted to do. And of course, I got to the point where I started actually, moving closer. I did my degree in sports science, and then I went traveling for a little bit. I came back. I decided that in order to because I only wanted to be a personal trainer, my ceiling at that point was personal trainer. I decided that I wanted to take every single step required in order to achieve that and be the best personal trainer I could. So I decided I was going to be a fitness instructor first. Then I got a fitness manager job off the back of that. And that was in some ways taking me away from the path I wanted, but in other ways it gave me some fantastic skills like selling, patience, building blocks and stepping stones to create a better outcome at the end. And then eventually I got into the personal training, and I flew with it because I'd spent so long preparing myself, and I was ready for it, and I went all in with that. They offered me to swap my rent money for hours working at the gym, and everybody did that. And I just turned up on day one, and I think at that time it was like 360 quid or something. And I had 360 quid. I had 500 quid. My rent was 300, and my bill for Fitness First and City Centre Manchester was 360. So I was down on money. I didn't have enough money, but I went in, and on day one I slapped down 360 quid on the table, and they said, "What's this?" I said, "It's my rent money for the month." They said, no, you just do some hours. I don't want to do some hours. I will earn more in those 10 hours of work you want me to do than this rent is worth. And they said, well, yeah, nobody does this. Well, I am. And what I did was create a solid, stable business, which really taught me the value of talking to people and how to communicate with different types of people, which you can bring throughout your whole career, because each individual is different, but also in a multi-sport environment where I ended up with kind of EIS, you're talking to a netball player not the same way you talk to a rugby player, to a water polo player, to a taekwondo athlete, to all these different sports. It's like taking a different hat off, and it's like Superman. Or not. I'm not comparing myself to Superman. I'm just saying that you have a different uniform. And then when I would change my uniform to work with a different sport, because they all liked you to wear their uniform, when I would change my uniform, I would change my mindset and my mentality. It was almost like, right, reset. How do I need to communicate with these people and ensure that I don't cross over, because I knew that I couldn't talk to the taekwondo athletes the same way as I could the water polo boys. So, but yeah, so I hit my ceiling with the personal training. So I'd reached my goal. Obviously, Britney Spears still eludes me, but I'd hit the goal with the personal training, and it wasn't going any further. And I had made a decision at that point that I wanted to train athletes, and was just looking for a way to do it. And I actually made some pretty extreme changes. So I had that personal training business was probably worth about 50,000 at the time. I was working really well, and everything was good. I had a city centre flat in Manchester, and I was trying to make it like semi-pro rugby, putting about 25 hours a week into that. And I just jacked the whole lot in, and just jacked it in like that. And I moved over to Sheffield to do an unpaid internship. Got myself a five grand's worth of debt. Started living in a hovel, working every hour that was available. I say working, I wasn't working at all. I had like no income. Well, that's a lie, actually. I was earning £35 a week, but I had to travel, costing me £20 to go and earn that 35. So it was the things we do when we're interns, I guess. And yeah, so if we fast forward a little bit, I did 8 months there at EIS in Sheffield. I managed to get a job with EIS in Manchester as a contractor, from having applied for the women's water polo job. I didn't get that because I didn't have my UKSCA, but I did get asked to apply for the men's water polo job, and no one else had been asked. So basically, it was mine if I didn't cock it up. But the guy who was in charge of EIS at the time, like S&C wise, he didn't. I don't know if he didn't want me, but basically, he kind of made my life pretty miserable. And you got the carrot and the stick, and he just used to beat me with a stick. Well, luckily at that time, stick I responded to. I mean, I'd been trying to play rugby, and I was used to getting beaten around, putting my head into problems, and that continued. But I just changed from getting beaten up on a rugby pitch to getting beaten up professionally, and mentally rather than physically. So it didn't faze me, or I didn't think it did. But over time, it starts to grind you down and wear you down. I think on a few occasions, he basically said, I don't know what you've been doing for the last 8-9 months. Like you're worse than an intern. You're pretty much nowhere. And I was 26, 27 at the time. And I said, okay, well, guess I'm going to have to show you that's not the case. So I was on that journey with the EIS for a while. I managed to convince him, change his mind. Then he moved on. So things started to change a little bit. I then it's been a bit up and down my career. Like you'll hear it from this tale, I suppose. I got asked to reapply for my own job from one of the sports, and I didn't get it. Because I thought I had a stinker at the interview, but it wasn't because of that at all. I came to realize after it was because the performance director didn't like the way I was coaching the athletes and the relationship I had with the athletes. Now that relates to things like, my training group, I had about 8 or 9 athletes, and I think maybe 70-75% of them had problems with behavior, ADHD, all sorts of different like home problems, different backgrounds, and they were just absolutely wild. They were totally bonkers. They were doing backflips off the wall, parkour. You'd see them stood on the top of squat racks, all sorts of crazy shit. And he would come in and he would see this stuff and think that there was just no control. To a certain extent, there was no control, but when it was time to work, they worked. And I had a rapport and a relationship with them where I tried to manage risk as best I could. I mean, they weren't on the racks all the time. That only happened once. But essentially what I'm saying is that he came in and saw a snapshot. So that was and he made some decisions probably then and there that this guy probably isn't right for our program. I don't want my program run like this. So regardless of the physical improvements and what the athletes thought and the relationships I had with them, that was meaningless. And that was my first real taste of people's different agendas at different stages and levels throughout an organization. So understanding that in order for me to get on side with those athletes down at the bottom, I had to be a certain way. And I did have them on side. I was always fine with the athletes, but they don't matter because the guy at the top is the one who's paying the bills. So unless you get that guy on side somehow, then and help him to understand what it is you're doing and really truly understand what it is he wants, then you're going to be you're going to fall foul throughout your entire career. So that was my first taste of that. I was lucky then. I kind of fell into a job at Rotherham Titans and had 3.5 years there. 2 were absolutely fantastic, but brutally hard work. The guys were absolute savages. The players, it was a proper like spit and sawdust rocky environment. And that was the culture that we'd created. It was gritty. It was the word they like to use. It's gritty, like Rotherham were gritty. But first 2 years we played this like jouet, like run it from your own try line kind of rugby. It was absolutely amazing to watch, and everybody loved it. We were on Sky Sports more than half the Premiership teams were, because they knew that Rotherham played such like wonderful rugby. The head coach then moved on to Wasps. A couple of new coaches came in. One was towards the back end, my life just turned to like a living hell, really. I was done with, I felt like I'd learned all I could from Rotherham within like the first 2 years. And then it just started to kind of go downhill, and I got into a real funk. I totally lost my mojo for, I guess, work and the industry. I kind of fell out of love with the industry and as a person a little bit. And I had so many interviews, and I just bombed out all of them because of my mentality and the way I was projecting myself. And then we kind of jumped forward to India, really. How I kind of got there isn't the most important thing, really, but what happened in India was I absolutely got put myself back on the map, or India put me back on the map. India, for those of you who have been or know anything about it, is one of the most like disgusting, filthy, like horrible, stinking, polluted, crowded, beautiful, wonderful, amazing, kindest people you'll ever meet in your life, magical, happiest places you'll ever go in your entire life. It's like a total contradiction, and it's total oxymoron. And it just, I'm eternally grateful for what happened in India. Like that was the best decision I've ever made in my life to go there. Then I did a lot of quite cool things there, in terms of working with different types of athletes, wrestlers, a couple of very famous sisters called the Pogat sisters, who ended up being the stars of a film called Dangal, which is currently the highest grossing film in Bollywood history. And I was coaching them for a period of time whilst they were actually on the road to promote the film. So that was pretty wild, having so many like hordes of people coming in, like watching the sessions that we were doing and screaming and shouting. And we're talking like Messi and Ronaldo type famous in that circle, in that area. So that was pretty incredible. Did some work as the rehab guy with the football team, the Bangalore Football Club, and then I was in charge of the boxing program for 7-year-olds up until 24. And we moved over to an institute of sport, and we brought people from all corners of India to this institute. Some of them had never seen running water. They'd never seen a toilet. So we had all these bizarre situations where they would use the shower head to fill the bucket of water, take the bucket of water onto the roof, and then pour the buckets of water on themselves to shower and wash. They didn't know what a toilet was, so they'd be crapping in a bucket and throwing it over the hedge kind of thing. So, these things were just kind of normal. The cultural challenges and the differences were just absolutely amazing. And that kind of set me up really well for moving over to Romania with the Special Forces. So that was a job with EXOS. We were contracted by a tactical contract company who were the prime contractor. They were employed by the US government. And we went over to Romania to help kind of, I guess the word is modernise their Special Forces and apply a human performance program. So whilst I was there, I had kind of like 4 bosses. So I had the US government, I had EXOS, I had the tactical company that I was was my parent company, if you like, and I had the Romanian government. So I was kind of playing like 3D chess the whole time, trying to appease everybody. And so that was quite an interesting challenge. And yeah, again, like an absolutely bizarre journey, just weird and wonderful, just setting up a program from absolute scratch in a nation that wasn't hugely forward thinking in terms of human performance, and a little bit stuck in its ways in some regards as well. So that contract came to a close at the end of this January. It was just a natural conclusion. It got extended by 6 months. So we saw out that 6 months, and then that was it. And right now I've got 2 things on the go. So I'm doing some work with Hinsa Performance with corporate work, some corporate clients, and also with a Formula 2 racing driver. And at the very beginning of that chapter, so not too much detail I can go into there. And then the other side of things that I'm doing right now is I've just set up a company called the Career Blueprint, which is essentially helping anybody who is on their career pathway and journey to get a little bit more clarity and a little bit more direction with how they're going to achieve what they want, how to define what they want, and how to get there. So I won't go into too much more detail. I know that was a bit waffly, but I'm sure we'll dig into a bit of that as we go.
One thing I do want to dig into that we discussed off air briefly is your take on the burn the bridges analogy that some people have. So some people listening to this might think he had a £50,000 business, and by all accounts sounded like you were doing pretty successful, having yourself set up in Manchester, to then jack that all in and do unpaid work at the English Institute for Sport in Sheffield. So for those who don't know the burn the bridges analogy, do you want to elaborate on that further? And secondly, do you want to explain how you got yourself in the headspace to justify that to yourself, and if you had a partner at the time, your partner?
Well, first things first, the partner went out the window she got burnt with the boat, shall we say. So yeah, I mean, like the way I interpret the burn the boats is like, I don't know too much about that story, to be honest with you, but the way I interpret it is, you just, like, you go all in, like you just throw all your chips down on one thing and that's it, you're doing it, and like it's make or bust, simple as that. Sink or swim, you know, you choose whatever, like a snippet you want for that. And when you look at something on face value, that's exactly what it will appear to be, that this guy's burnt all the bridges. Oh no, we can't go back. What's he done? He's an absolute nutcase. Well, I'm pretty sure that he would have ensured that he had set himself up for success, that he will have the correct people with him. He will have done the correct amount of research, or the available research. He will have chefs with him. He'll have probably some sort of method or system of purifying water, or figuring out whether he can purify water. I don't know if they had that back then. He will have some specialists on survival. He will have probably some boat builders, so he could always rebuild some boats. But you know, these things don't get talked about. That's the background. That's the things that go on, like behind the lights. Everybody sees, like, oh my god, you're nuts. You've quit a 50k job and you're going to do an unpaid internship. Yes, but I've been setting myself up for the last 5 or 6 years for this, and I have been building the skills required in order to be a success in this industry. It's not just, I've just thought, no, fuck it, I'm just going to go and do that now. I fancy doing this. I'm going to quit everything. No, I'd put all the big rocks in place prior to making that decision. Did I have, in terms of the stakes, did I have anything to fall back on? No, I did not. But what I did have, and then I burnt the boats a number of times, but it's always been on my terms. And I learned all of the lessons and put all the steps in place up to that one point. And then, you know, that self-belief that I had instilled has allowed me to be a success, I suppose.
Yeah, and whilst I certainly wouldn't advocate this as financial advice, I've read from certain books that are saying stuff like, well, if you're going to go all in, you might as well go it all in, for example, run yourself broke in, say, your 20s, than do that when you're 60. So it makes a lot of sense to do that when you're younger, and the opportunity cost is arguably obviously still high at that certain point in time, but comparatively speaking, doing that when you say 50, 60, 70 and pissing away your pension pot is a lot different.
Yeah, well, let's put it in perspective. I mean, like, you could say I've burnt the boats like probably 5, 6, 7, 8 times in my career. But every single time, like when I moved to India, like, I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't have a bloody clue. And I purposely did next to no research so that it was a massive adventure. And I also didn't have a bloody clue about Romania. I didn't know what was going to happen there. In fact, we only really had, at that point, three months funding. So I didn't know what was going to happen after, and I've just moved to France. I don't know what's going to happen here. I don't even know if I'm going to get my residency. Don't tell the government that. And you know, all of these things. What was the worst that could happen to me if it didn't work out in India? I'd move back to my parents. Yeah, that would suck, but I'd move back. What would be the worst thing if it didn't work out in Romania? I would have moved in with, you know, my missus, or I would have gone back to the UK. You know, it wasn't going to be the end of the world. You adapt and you move on. So, yeah.
I just listening to you say that reminds me of, I'm pretty sure it's a TED talk that I'd recommend people check out, by Tim Ferriss, where he talks about the importance of defining your fears rather than defining your goals. So like you've just done there, it's like, right, if this exploration of whatever goal it is doesn't work out, what actually will happen? Like, yeah, it's like you said, not ideal to move in with your parents, but compared to, I don't know, other people's lives where it's like, oh, you could go homeless and then live on the street, it's a darn sight better.
Yeah, I mean, without going too far off script, like, one of the biggest fears that everybody has is not having a job or an income. Well, here's an idea: build your own. And you build your own, and then you've always got that, unless you choose to not tend to it. You don't become reliant on someone else employing you if you're building something for yourself, and that can then become your job, your career, your pathway. So it doesn't always have to be, oh Jesus, what's going to happen if I lose this job? Okay, I've lost this job. However, I've been building in the background. So I've been setting myself up for the future. So.
Yeah, no, I like that. I like that. We'll dive a little bit more into the career development stuff a little bit later in the podcast, but just to bring it back to the tactical athlete then, you first got in touch with me having seen a video that I'd posted after watching SAS Who Dares Wins and my interpretation of how I might train a tactical athlete. Obviously, you've been there and done it. So firstly, if you were to give the listeners, I suppose, a needs analysis of what a tactical athlete has to be physically prepared for, as someone with your experience, how would you go about breaking down what they do as a strength and conditioning coach, and obviously someone who's been there and done it?
Yeah, so I guess the whole point of a needs analysis is to define what they need to be able to do, when they need to be able to do it, and to what level they need to be able to do that thing, and how long, I suppose. Now, that is near enough undefinable for a tactical athlete. So what you tend to do is just kind of plan and prepare for kind of worst case scenarios. So what you can do is you can get together, and I'm sure this has been done, which is where a lot of the research has come from. A lot of the early studies and the early research talks about the worst case scenario type planning and training. And a guy called John Paul Nevin, who would be a really good guest for you, actually, he spoke to me about how he's helped to redefine the way that the British military trains its athletes or its soldiers. When he went downrange, and he was 60 kilos. He weighed 60 kilos. He was having to carry 75 kilos, including weapon and his burger and his pack. And they were having to do relatively long range infills. And as part of their exfil, one of the guys in their team got in terrain that was, Afghanistan. So like it was up, down, up, down, up, down, like proper mountainous territory. And on their exfil, they had a casualty, and they had to carry them out. And he said that it was the most horrendous, awful thing that he's ever experienced, and it could have been catastrophic for the whole team, and it very nearly was. And he then made some real big pushes to change the way in which people are training their soldiers in the UK. So he's been instrumental in that, and essentially, it's very difficult to define what it is an operator needs to be able to do, but fundamentally they've got to be able to be functional when they get to where they're going. So they have to be able to infill. If they're going to infill and go and, they're going to go and do whatever their mission set is, then they've got to be able to get out. And so they might be, their pace plan, their primary exit strategy is to be picked up by the chopper, like on site, on target, but it's possible that might change. Then their alternative is that they have to hump it, like 5 clicks to a secondary option, which again could be wiped out by whatever reason. So their contingency is that they then have to move this distance, but they can do so via vehicle. And then their emergency is they've got to hump it across a border. So they've got to go to the nearest border. And that's the type of thing that these guys are having to plan for and deal with. So in order to plan for and deal with that, you're establishing what it is they need to be able to do on each specific deployment. And what they tend to do is have a very good base level, which is why the military is so strict. Well, they should be stricter in lots of ways, because there's a fair bit of obesity creeping in now. But there's a fair amount of physical testing to ensure that baseline stays at a good level. And then when they're training up for a deployment, they're training up for that specific deployment. So a lot of them, if they're doing what they call kind of like running and gunning, which would be going down, streets and streets and streets, clearing houses, and they're going to be stationed in a city, then they don't need to be super fit, but they need to be big, they need to be strong, and they need to be able to do it over and over and over, like have the resiliency to do it over and over. So there's a bit of a tendency towards like a little bit more lifting and maybe a little bit more metabolic resistance type training, CrossFit type stuff. But fundamentally, they need to be able to push, pull, drag, carry, and we're talking, heavy loads, pushing and pulling and dragging and carrying as part of their jobs. then they need to be able to move with load on their backs at a decent pace. That's kind of a very brisk walk, which would be uncomfortable for any of us really to hold on the street. They need to be able to do that with load and a weapon. They also need to be able to, run when they need to be, when they're required to, with kit.
And
so
go on.
No, you go.
I was just going to say, just cycling back to what you said a couple of minutes ago, forgive my ignorance, but when you say infill and exfil, what do you mean by that?
So infill is when they get kind of dropped off, so they're infiltration, and then they're exfiltration. So when they get dropped off at their insertion point and then their pickup point, if you like.
Perfect. And in terms of, you said that John Paul Nevin had been instrumental in revitalizing how the British military train their guys. So what are some of the key mistakes either yourself or John would probably see with how military personnel are typically trained?
So that's something that baffles me. I really truly don't understand it. Like, we are putting so much time and attention into training elite athletes who essentially go and run around a track or chase a ball, or they go and throw a stick, like, or whatever the sport is. You break it down, and golf is hitting a little ball with a metal stick. And you've got soldiers who are going to fight for whatever country, for national peace or world peace. They're putting their lives at risk, yet they're not trained anywhere near to the same degree and level that an athlete is. They're not given the same exposure. They don't often have the same facilities, and it absolutely drives me nuts. I just don't understand it. So some of the biggest mistakes that we'll see is an overemphasis on one physical quality. So typically they're either a lifter or a runner, or they're either endurance based or they're a lifter. That there's becoming a little bit of a better balance now, but there's definitely like a predominance where you could almost get away with being just one, and you could still pass your basic tests. So that becomes a little bit more challenging now, and you can see that they're changing. The US guys, they always lead the way with all the physical stuff. They lead the way, and the rest of the world's probably about 10 years behind them in terms of the adopting some newer methods, should we say? Apart from maybe the Brits in terms of the elite side, and yeah, the biggest errors that we make are that we react to things, and we react to catastrophic events. And it takes a catastrophic event for everybody to look in the mirror and say, you know what, we were not fit enough to do that. And because of that, people died. And that's, to me, that's terrible. It's shocking. But it seems to be often the way that things are done. Yeah, like I said, there's the predominance to really focus only on one physical quality. There's a massive lack of attention paid to things like mobility and general robustness in terms of movement quality. So you might get a guy that could deadlift like 250 kilos, but you ask him to do an overhead squat, or you ask him to do a basic like hip opening exercise, and he's like, he's like the Tin Man, he can't do it. So you're thinking, how are you going to walk up a hill and drag a casualty with one arm with your body fully rotated? Like, how are you going to do that without breaking yourself or getting injured and becoming a liability for the rest of your team? So yeah, massive, there's a real lack of that mobility. There's a lack of balance, I guess, is the way to describe it. Lack of balance.
And it's just coming back to a couple of examples you've said then. Obviously, as is the case with a lot of sports, there'll be a benefit that you can get from, say, improving your strength or improving your lifting up to a certain point, and then it's, what's the word I'm looking for? The
diminishing returns, or a cost.
Yes, exactly. So you can't afford to be, for example, you can't afford to exclusively pursue strength or exclusively pursue running. Do you have any metrics or any standards in your experience where it's like, right, minimum baseline, we need to be operating here, and once we get past this, we now need to explore improvements in other areas?
I think it depends on what the group are required to do. So you will have set groups that are, you don't have to have a totally balanced spider chart. You can have you're a lifter, you can have that, but you have to have a minimum threshold. And normally their baseline standards for, I don't know, what would it be? Like they change all the time, but they're talking about, a 12 minute, 12 and a half minute 3K or 2 mile. You're talking about, minimum of sort of 10 pull-ups around that 10 mark. Sometimes it's less, but ideally your operators really should be busting out close to 20, in my opinion. But it's not always that easy to define. Like if you really, really suck at rucking, like there were the marches with the loaded march, then you're never going to make it. If you really suck at running, you're never going to make it. You can get strong, but it's damn sight harder to get fit in this world than it is to get strong. So they'll often get spat out the back because they don't have the capacity to be able to do it day in, day out, and they get worn down and beaten down by the general training that takes place, as opposed to the actual, the day-to-day of the job is wearing them down, because it's accumulated load which they can't tolerate because there's that lack of capacity.
And we'll dive into the accumulated load and the rucking in a second. But just to explore something you mentioned earlier about robustness. Now, obviously, conceptually, I can get my head around, for example, not breaking when you're doing these rucks or carrying the Bergen for days on end. But how would you go about assessing or developing robustness for military personnel? Is there a specific testing battery, or is it just a simple case of, look, can you do this, yes or no?
Yeah, I think that this question of testing has been flogged to death by so many different people. It's if the shoe fits. So whatever you feel you need to do, you can do it, as long as it gives you a metric to be able to provide some sort of improvement. And do you always have to have a metric to know that you're doing good work? No. But sometimes we have to justify our jobs, and that was why we did it. And we did an FMS, full FMS, and then we did a modified FMS. Was it the best strategy? No. Was it one of the only ones that we felt, was it valuable to us? Yes. Did it help us inform our programming? Yes. Did we see improvements in our movement qualities from our operators and our recruits based on a test, retest, and an intervention strategy? Yes. So from that perspective, were we able to provide people with intervention plans that were specific to where they scored really poorly? Yes. But it wasn't just, oh, you've got poor shoulder range, so we're going to give you shoulder exercises. Those exercises are thoracic mobility, their shoulder mobility. There's elements of synchronization with hip opening. There's everything. So it's never just, you're going to do one type of movement with regards to robustness. So yeah, I think the robustness side of things is really important, but there's a line between the tissue tolerance is kind of bundled into that as well, and what tissues are going to come under real stress, and where that's going to create issues for the joint. So for example, if your calves aren't doing what they need to be able to do, then if you're not used to walking uphill in boots, then because you haven't conditioned your calves properly, then your ankle is going to become vulnerable and susceptible to sprains and strains. And we see it time and time again. So we would implement quite intense protocols for these types of things to ensure that the areas that were most at risk were getting the treatment or the time and attention they needed. And they're most at risk because they're the areas that typically people won't train for. So you ask somebody to get prepared for a selection event or for a prep course, which was in our case, and more often than not, most guys aren't putting a bag on their back and going for a ruck. They're not doing it because it's easier and it's nicer and it's more comfortable to go in the gym. They ain't putting the bag on their back and going off into the hills. So needless to say, which activity do they suck at the most? Rucking. Which is the most injurious activity? Rucking. Which activity do the most people break during? Rucking. So yeah, it's not rocket science.
So when you said, for example, or if you're able to elaborate on, when you say stuff like intense protocols and I suppose bulletproofing those sites most at risk, could you give the listeners, for example, an example of the session and the sets, reps, maybe the exercise selection that you might be doing for these areas?
Yeah, so in my scenario, I had, like, I'll use the first year as an example. So we had 189 guys walk through the door. So we were breaking that down into field teams of about 66, something around 60, something like that. And so everything is defined by the logistics. So what we would do is we would spend some time at the beginning working on some movement quality and some movement competency with the basic movements of, squatting, lunging, hinging, that side of things. And then we would move into some sort of strength work. We would do mobility work, which would be general in terms of hip work, thoracic, shoulder. It would all be quite general, but that's what they needed at that point. And then we would do our strength work. We would do some sort of ESD. They all have big issues with their trunk, so we would always bundle in some. The two biggest issues we had really were their mobility and their capacity. So we took some of the focus away from the resistance side of things by chucking in, by supersetting everything. So there was a larger metabolic component to it. And we then also, that reduced the loads that they were able to lift because strength was not our priority. They all scored reasonably well on their kind of muscular endurance strength related tests. And we would bundle in so we might do let's say, a reverse lunge, a front-loaded reverse lunge kettlebell, and we might pair that with some iso pull-ups in 3 different positions. Then we would do something like a world's greatest stretch or a pigeon stretch. Then they would their pigeon stretch, they'd do 20 seconds each side, then they'd start the set again. So do set number 2, set number 3, set number 4. Very limited rest. And as if their quality started to reduce, we would reduce the amount of reps that they were doing, and we would increase the amount of mobility work that they were doing per set. Then once we'd done kind of 2 batches, 2 supersets of some sort of strength work, we would move into what I like to call like a conditioning based circuit. So we would pair together something like a loaded carry with some sort of calf work, which would be like normally tiptoe walks, which I liked. So in a square, so you're hitting the different angles. Then we would do some sort of trunk work, like a bear crawl forward and back. Then there would probably be some sort of retraction based work in there. And putting that together as a circuit, spreading them out a little bit as well, so they had a little bit of a movement in between each one, was a really good way to firstly keep the flow going, and secondly shoehorn in some tissue tolerance or postural conditioning, if you like.
Yeah, that's great. It's funny because it reminds me of a conversation I was having with a friend of mine yesterday, and he basically said, for longevity purposes, if you had to pick between strength and endurance training, which one would you pick? And I said, well, firstly, obviously it's a binary question, but I was like, that's assuming that your strength work can't enhance your endurance, which it absolutely can if you design it in, or you constrain it in the ways that you've just described.
Yeah, the constraints of the environment that I've been working in have been, it begins with variables, and what variables there are, the more variables there are, in my opinion, the easier it is to plan a session. So I like to say that I'm only actually good at 2 things in strength and conditioning. Number 1 is logistics. Like, I can put a session together in limited space with obscene numbers and still produce a performance-based outcome, because I'm aware of the logistics and limiting factors around lots of different things. And that probably stems from my work at Rotherham, where I'm the only guy managing 40 dudes who are all out for blood every single day, waiting for me to make a mistake. And the second thing is developing other coaches and developing other people. So those are my two kind of USPs or specialities, if you like. I'm not saying I'm trash at everything else, but I'd say I was good at those two things. So understanding variables and the impact they can have on performance is something I'm really, really interested in. I find it fascinating.
And just staying on the Special Forces topic before we dive into the career development stuff, in terms of accumulated load. So, for example, when people train up for selection, if anyone's ever seen SAS Who Dares Wins on the TV, they're clearly subjected to conditions which, if we're talking about elite athletes, wouldn't be considered optimal. So malnourished, potentially dehydrated, potentially lack of sleep. One question I've got is, if you were training somebody, so before their, 8 to 12 week camp with yourself, before they transition into that, how would you mitigate or prepare them for training in these less than optimal conditions? So for example, would it be the case of saying, look, your body is going to get absolutely battered in the next 8 weeks from a recovery perspective, so all the training you do before this, you should be well slept, you should be hydrated, you should be eating properly? Or from a psychological perspective, would you say, look, you're going to need to make sure that when you get into this 8-week camp, that this is not the first time you experience those sort of hardships, if that question makes sense?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've never known anybody to train somebody to get their ass kicked in terms of the SF world. So I've never known anybody to, stay up all night or do a training session at, like 4 a.m. or 3 a.m, having had 2 hours sleep just to, prepare for something that may or may not happen, because it changes, the process changes, and it does that. The principles remain the same, but they change the process in order to keep people guessing, but ensuring that they get the outcomes that they want. So I wouldn't advocate, staying up late and malnourishment, anything like that, because essentially you're just increasing your vulnerability and you're increasing your chances of actually getting injured when you get there. So what a lot of the guys do in the US at Ranger School is they tell them and they prepare them not to peak for day one. They arrange for their peak to come at like midway through, like at the end of that first week. I can't remember how long Ranger School is, but they're looking for them to actually be peaking like somewhere in the middle, when it starts to get really dirty, when they're getting into the horrendous side of things. I've also heard that some of the guys, like on those longer courses, like 8-12 weeks, are turning up chubby. So they're turning up like not fat, but overweight, so that they can chew into those stores and resources. And they're actually losing weight as they go. So everything's appearing to become easier. So if you turn up lean and mean, then there's only one way for you to go, isn't there? It's going to be start eating into your muscle mass. Interestingly, most of the people that we ever saw who turned up looking like freaks, like lean, mean, geez, he's trained for this, they don't make it. And equally, the ones who are, just clearly like fat and out of shape, they obviously don't make it either. So it's that middle ground, that kind of not quite a dad bod, but like, someone who clearly trains, who's in shape, but you could be in better shape than you are. And you see them at the end, you're like, okay, you planned for this, you were smart. So, I think probably it would be go through a rigorous training program. So you're used to carrying whatever like personal weight you have. And, but if you're overweight, because as soon as you get there, they're going to dictate your nutrition and you're going to drop pretty much instantaneously, and everything's going to seem a bit easier. It would obviously be some sort of taper so that you not for day one, because it's never that savage, like straight away. And you would, you'd ensure that you have a really solid base, but ultimately that your capacity to tolerate work day in, day out is up there. And you have to know that you can go to a horrible place. You have to know that you can do horrible like training and survive it. You know that you're mentally tough enough. There's a really good book called Building the Elite. and they post on Instagram they post once a day, and they're fantastic posts. What people aren't doing in their preparation for special forces is they're not preparing their minds as well as their bodies. So the amount of times that I have done it, you've probably done it, we've all done it, it's our mind is telling us that we can't do something, and our bodies say, yeah, you're right, actually I can't. But really it's understanding the mind and what the mind is trying to do, and then appeasing the mind, resetting, refocusing, and reinitiating the correct process. It's a 3 R's principle that the SF guys use. So recognizing that there's something going on, refocusing, and then re-engaging with the task. So you can apply that to any sort of scenario or situation, but it's really trying to understand. And it's almost like an internal conversation. We've all had it. Oh, you need to stop, this is too hard. And then, it's like the angel and the devil. Is it? Yeah, it is too hard. You really need to stop. You can't do this. Well, I think I can, actually. And which one wins is, if you think you can or you think you can't, you're probably right. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have to be a discussion with like the angel and the devil as to who wins. But what this book is talking about is ensuring that you have the mental processes in place and that you've understood what those processes are in order to deal with the devil, if you like.
I know this will probably differ on the basis of what the mission aim is, so it might be a bit hard to nail it down, but just in listening to you talk about the physique of successful, or the demographic of successful people who pass selection, if you had to state specific anthropometrics or stuff like that, whether it's height, weight, what kind of athlete would from another sport might you compare them to? Or if you had to build the ideal person for selection from a physical standpoint, what would that look like?
So I can tell you very, very specifically from about 10 or 15 years ago, because that's the guys that I was working with. So whilst I was in Romania, I was living and working with retired US Special Forces guys. Some of these dudes had like 27 years worth of experience. They were like proper fucking Jason Bourne motherfuckers, these guys. And every single one of the contractors, so there was a whole group of contractors, every time they came in, they all looked like identical. Like they were the same height, they were the same weight, and you can just picture them in their prime. 80 to 85 kilos, plus or minus 1 or 2 kilos. And I think it was 5'8", plus or minus 2 inches. Very rarely over 6 foot. And they were just lean, mean. They just went and went and went and went and went. And they were just straight up savages. And nowadays, we had, in our first year, we had somebody who was, I think, 6'6" graduate. Wow. And somebody who was 5'5" or 5'6". But the norm, I would say, is probably exactly in line with what I've just described. You could probably take a pool of people. I've got the statistics somewhere, but I think it would be around 185, 186 centimeters, maybe 100, around 100. And so what's that in feet? That's like 5'8", 5'10", probably about 5'10" was the average now. Then the average weight probably would have been about 80, 88, 89, probably similar. They would probably be, the Romanian guys, they more than likely, most of them would have had too much body fat. So they typically would have probably been sitting closer to 18%, I suppose, body fat, whereas really you'd want them closer to that, probably around 15, 16, I guess. And yeah, I mean, I suppose our averages when they left were, our best run time was like 10 for 3K was like 10:50, something like that. So he was flying, and the worst was probably like 13:10, and our average was around 12, 20, something like that. Pull-ups wise, the average was around 7. Bearing in mind we had guys who were injured and still doing the tests, so they were scoring like 0. And then we had guys who were doing like 23, 24, strict, just for fun. And then the average pull-ups was around, push-ups was around 70 or 80 in 2 minutes. And yeah, so that's the kind of standard, but it's changing. It's very much changing depending on the mission set. So they don't tend to do the averages like this anymore because it's not as relevant, really.
Yeah, no, I was just curious because anyone who's been following my Instagram of late will have seen me walking up. There's like a field near my house, which there's a hill and whatnot, and I finally built up to 30 kilos, and I'm thinking this is killing me, and this is in an evenly spaced barbell. Like how you deal with that mass as an awkward load strapped to your back, going for miles and miles and miles at end is beyond me.
It's easier. It's easier because the weight is evenly spread and the weight is centered on your hips. So you change your technique as you walk, so you can walk kind of like that.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can, that keeps the center, that keeps the load almost like straight down through the legs. So the hips are basically taking a lot of that. And then when you're going downhill, you're pushing your knees forward and sitting your ass back to try and push that center of mass, change that center of mass. But yeah, I mean, it's the first time you do it, you put 30 kilos on your back, it feels like a house, but you don't start at 30, you start at 10, and then you build and build and build the same way as you would someone just coming back into the gym. So,
and if you're programming rucking for your guys, when we talk about the variables, do you start by increasing the load and getting to a set distance? Do you start by hitting a set distance and then increasing the load? How do you do that?
Yeah, so with rucking, you've got a whole bunch of variables to play with. You've got speed, you've got terrain, you've got distance, you've got load, you've got what else is there? Speed, load, distance, terrain. Yeah, I mean, those are the main ones. And what we try to do is create some consistency so that some of them don't change. If all of them change, you don't really know how somebody's progressing. You don't really know the impact and the effect of it. So at some point, you have to take a risk and you have to draw a line in the sand, like a beginning line. So what we did is we said, right, you're going to do what they needed to do was a minimum of 20 kilos in the testing events. And we drew a line in the sand and we said, right, so we're going to begin with 20 kilos, but and we're going to keep our pace the same. And the thing that's going to change is our distance. And whatever time it takes for them to complete that is okay. We were all right with that. And eventually we were going to get it into the correct zone. And how we got to this was increase their exposure to rucking. So we did very limited amount of running. We never ran for more than like a kilometer during our first year training program. And we did like 1K intervals, and maximum would be like 4 of those. And that was the longest run they ever did. And they then went into the selection event and were doing 5, I don't know what it was in year 1, maybe like 5 and 8 mile runs or something. And they were crushing them. Because the accumulated load of the training week, of everything that they were doing, of the type of training that we were doing, of the high intensity kind of resistance-based training, of the circuits, of the tactical work that they were doing day in, day out, was building the base for them. So if we jump back to rucking, we would say we would do a tempo ruck early in the week. So we would do that was to help people get the hang of the pace. So that would be like with the 20 kilos, they would have done their run. So they would have gone and done some interval based running, and then we'd come back to the gym, we'd put the boots on, and then we'd go for a walk, basically 20 to 30 minutes maximum amount of time. And we would aim to shift to move at the pace that we were going to move at. They would always carry their weapons, and they would have 20 kilos on their back, and we would do our best to keep everybody together. If people are dropping out in 20, 30 minutes, their chances of making it through the whole thing are just next to none. So I would allow a bit of a slinky there, but ideally there should be no slinky. It's not how things are done, really. But from a training perspective, where I was, that was a good opportunity for everybody to see who was who was where, and for them to really realize, geez, that's the pack, I'm this far behind, I need to up my game, or I need to bugger off. And then at the back end of the week, which is normally a Friday, we would do our longer range movements. So we began our 8-week process at around 6.5 clicks, and then we finished at 18. So in 8 weeks, we got them from 6.5 up to 18 with a real undulating program that was absolutely undulating terrain, whatever the conditions were. Sometimes it was snowing, sometimes it was terrible rain, sometimes it was warm. But yeah, ultimately they got the work done. Not always in the times that we wanted, but we were generally okay with that. The people who were going to pass normally achieved it. We had in the second year, we had a group join us 3 weeks in, and they were kind of a civilian group that had just come straight in off the street, and they were studs. Honestly, they're absolute freaks. And they got to the first ruck march, and they were nowhere. They just got absolutely blown apart by these guys who were worse physically, but they'd done 3 weeks worth of build-up event. And we thought maybe these civilians are good to go, so we put them in at a slightly lower distance, but we were going to stop them a couple of clicks before the other guys, and they were nowhere. They were honestly so far behind, it was unbelievable. They just couldn't walk with load on their back. So we had to hugely change their program and expose them to that in order to get them to a point where they were going to be able to do what we needed them to do.
And
so
I'm just going to say, how much of that would you say is physical versus mental? And I only ask because since last 3-4 weeks, part of my training that I've been doing myself is walk the barbell up to the hill, do a few complexes, come back down. And in week 1, I was like, fucking hell, this is 20 kilos. I'm going to have to stop. Whereas now, because I know I've done it, I'm like, well, you've done it before without stopping, so now you don't need to. And I don't really know how much physical adaptation would have taken place in that versus you've done it now, as you said, for 3 weeks.
Yeah. Rocking is a bit of a skill. So firstly, you get used to it. And secondly, those 3 weeks, those other guys had the accumulation of all the rest of the volume as well. So they are starting to get the adaptations kicking in. They probably lost a fair amount of weight, and like body mass has started to reduce. So the dead weight, the body fat normally would be trimming down by this point. And there is the physical and mental side of it. Mentally, it is tough because it's plod, like non-stop. So this is why Rucking is such a good event to judge where people are. But physically, yeah, it's massively physical as well. It's hugely physical. It's probably the most taxing event that they do on a weekly basis. So it's there's a huge amount of both in there really. But I wouldn't want to hang my hat on it being more one than the other. But the impact of not having 3 weeks worth of prior events, 3 rucks plus 2 tempo rucks, so 5 rucks in total, or 6 rucks in total. The impact of not having had the bag on the back for six sessions was huge.
And finally, just on the subject of rucking, what kind of athletes or people do you think would benefit most from rucking outside of the tactical populations?
I think that anybody could. I would probably want to avoid it with people who are predominantly desk bound, because of the areas that it puts strain. Typically, if you're a little bit weaker, or there's areas that change your posture, so it's going to shift where the strain is placed. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a great way to add some intensity in a non-aggressive way to a walk. So walking is relatively kind of tax-free, if you like. It's fairly low calorie, but it gets the heart rate going. But yeah, chuck it in. I definitely add it in to a lot of people's programs. From an athlete's perspective, I don't necessarily think it's got a place. Maybe as a bit of variation in the off season, but I probably wouldn't chuck it in with an athlete. You did ask a question earlier as to what sort of athlete would make a good operator, and the answer would be an MMA fighter. Probably you wouldn't want to go with the heavyweights, or so, you know, those around the side kind of 90 kilos a maximum. A boxer, they tend to be badasses. Anyone who's in some sort of combat-based sport, anyone who's done any sort of wrestling, they tend to just crush it. If someone turns up and they got cauliflower ears, then you're pretty much like, yeah, you're going to make it, mate. Don't worry about it, because you know that they could just take a beating because they've had a beating. I'd also say rugby players, but specifically maybe like a lithe back row forward, probably around that 90 kilo mark, or a centre, probably would be like a gritty centre around the same sort of weight would normally do pretty well.